All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Boost CYAC's webinar series. My name is Cassidy Wallis, although just recently Beaner, and I'm very excited to be here today hosting this webinar. Before we begin our session, there are a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on Floor on the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of the screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the Documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in either French or English by also clicking on the Documents on the right. There will be a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of this webinar, and to submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging, and then Participants, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time. And if you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants by clicking on in the group, on Messaging, and then Participants. Without further ado, we will now begin our discussion. So I am a doctorate student at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, or UBCO. And I received my Master's of Arts from UBCO, specializing in psychological science. And today we'll actually be discussing my thesis, its findings, and how these can be applied in child interviews to obtain more expedient disclosures. I also want to acknowledge that I provide one small perspective, and I realize that you all attending here today have wonderful insight provided through experience and expertise in the field. I hope that leaving here today, I can at least provide a more informed approach to child interviews and to obtaining formal disclosures in a timely manner. So first, I would like to acknowledge the Child Advocacy Center of Kelowna and the Kelowna RCMP. Without these partnerships, this research would not have been possible, and I commend all the frontline workers out there for their outstanding service to the community. I would also like to acknowledge, of course, my committee, my supervisor, Dr. Michael Woodworth, who guided this research, as well as Dr. Zach Walsh and Dr. Paul Davies. So today, we will begin by discussing why disclosure is so important, followed by the theoretical underpinnings of disclosure. I'll then outline our study design, and the body of this presentation will be heavily focused on my findings and how they can be applied by frontline workers and CYACs. I'll then wrap up with some final takeaways. So an estimated 12% of individuals have reported to experience some form of sexual abuse in their childhood, demonstrating the pervasiveness of this issue. Now, we also know how devastating it is for those who have experienced it. For perpetrator conviction or disruption of contact, child testimony is often required in lieu of physical evidence, as there is rarely any for this crime. However, disclosure of sexual abuse in childhood, or as I may refer to it, CSA, can be difficult to obtain as children face multiple barriers to reporting abuse. And longer delays of disclosure result in lower conviction rates and greater psychological symptoms for children. Now, the purpose of the current study was to examine how child and abuse characteristics, as well as non-offending caregiver support, can impact delays of disclosure in sexual abuse experienced in childhood. Now, even in the presence of evidence, such as video recordings or medical examinations, children may still deny allegations, recant statements, or simply fail to disclose during investigative interviews. This is in great part due to the barriers that youth face in reporting abuse, including fear, lack of support or understanding, and even in some cases, embarrassment. In fact, 1 in 5 children who experience sexual abuse do not disclose until adulthood, but far more may not disclose at all. And even fewer, of course, make it to this formal disclosure stage or reporting stage. Now, a formal disclosure is a formal report made to a frontline worker, specifically in this case, one made during an investigation into sexual abuse allegations. Now, non-disclosure has been linked to 3 adverse outcomes. First, non-disclosure may result in poor mental health and post-traumatic stress over time. Formal disclosures, of course, also come with access to much needed resources and treatment for those impacted. However, if a disclosure is delayed, doesn't make it to the stage, or is later recanted, in many cases, no formal support can be obtained. And if abuse is prolonged, children may risk symptoms of complex trauma in the wake of no psychological support. Secondly, non-disclosure or delays of disclosure also delay formal investigations, which of course may risk the loss of valuable evidence. For example, it is recommended that medical exams be carried out within 72 hours, and of course, corroborative detail in witness statements may be lost over time. And third, perpetrators are unlikely to be held responsible without disclosure of abuse from the child. An arguably even greater consequence of this lack of disclosure is that youth are continually put in danger's way. Now, in order to maximize the ease of the experience, accuracy, and efficiency of child disclosure, it's imperative to better understand factors that both aggravate and mitigate delays of disclosure in investigations into sexual abuse. Now, Brennan and McAlvany in 2020 set out to explore antecedents of childhood and adolescent disclosure in a qualitative meta-analysis. In compiling the data from previous research, 2 overarching themes emerged. First was the need to tell, or rather intrapersonal factors, which comprised the realization, emotional distress, and the need for something to be done. Now, in the case of realization, children may not recognize abusive acts as abusive. This could be developmental in nature or because of the complex relationships between perpetrators and children. Further, part of the grooming process involves the normalization of abusive acts by the perpetrator, which can cause further confusion for children regarding what is normal or appropriate, especially when that abuse begins early on. Understandably then, realization occurs over time and with the development of language and understanding of what constitutes abuse. Now, in other cases, an inability to cope with emotional distress can lead children to disclose. Emotional distress may be manifested in a number of ways, such as through anger, sadness, or even physical violence, and can occur over the course of hours or even years. Now, the final interpersonal factor was the need to do something, or the need for something to be done. This is in order to protect both themselves and other children, and can relate to abuse that might be severe or even frequent. This might then prompt the child to disclose rather than experiencing further abuse. Now, the second theme was opportunity to tell, which comprised interpersonal factors. Opportunity to tell was highly dependent on having access to someone they can trust and expecting to be believed. Having a trusted individual to tell was the most highly rated factor impacting decision to disclose in this study, in fact. And trusted individuals included family, peers, school teachers, and even sports coaches. Now, these adults may then go on to make a formal report of abuse on behalf of the child, facilitating access to supports and inhibiting future abuse. Now, the 2 main themes of need to tell and opportunity to tell coalesce in being asked. Often, children, especially young children, require prompting before they disclose. This can be a difficult task for caregivers who may be too embarrassed to discuss such topics or may not know how to broach such sensitive topics with their children. Now, these themes demonstrate what McElvany and colleagues in 2012 termed the pressure cooker effect, in which a child's internal conflict and eventual decision to disclose is highly dependent on both internal and external pressure. Now, child and abuse characteristics can theoretically serve to increase the need to tell in the following ways. Young age of child at abuse onset can impact their ability to understand the abuse and realize it's wrong. Being male, related, and experiencing more severe or frequent abuse can increase the emotional distress experienced by the child. Of course, frequent or severe abuse can substantially impact the feelings of a need to do something. And as for opportunity to tell, if the perpetrator is closely related, it could negatively impact their ability to access a trusted adult or increase fears of not being believed. Now, these factors can all be moderated, of course, by non-offending caregiver support. If children perceive their non-offending caregiver as supportive, they may be more likely to disclose to this trusted adult, and of course would expect to be believed. Now, previous research has found that children can accurately predict how their caregiver will respond to a disclosure of sexual abuse before even disclosing. If they expect a supportive response, they'll typically receive it. But if they expect an unsupportive one, they may not disclose. Now, there were several aims of the current study and aspects which make it unique. The first and overarching goal was to examine barriers that children face when making the decision to disclose experiences of sexual abuse. Next was to examine the unique impact that child and abuse characteristics have on delays of disclosure, rather than just the presence of one. So to examine the process of disclosure in more detail. And the final aim was to examine the role of non-offending caregiver support in formal disclosures and delays of formal disclosures. Now, as for my procedure, first I had to go through a strict security clearance protocol in order to gain access to these classified RCMP case files. Once I had access, an RCMP employee selected files from their database for me to code. I will discuss how cases were selected on my next slide. Now, when going through the files, I noted important dates, such as first incident and forensic disclosure, and I also looked for child and abuse characteristics. And finally, I measured non-offending caregiver support behaviors, which I will identify later. Now, files were coded onto an encrypted, password-protected laptop. And for our analyses, we looked at descriptive statistics, Pearson correlations, and conducted a multivariate Cox regression analysis. Now, some considerations we had were centered on the mental health of those reviewing the case files, which was myself. And because of the sensitive nature of the files, I coded for no more than 3 hours at a time, once a day. Coding them, though, I will admit, was emotionally taxing, and I feel allowed me a small glimpse into the hardship that you all encounter in your work day to day. Now, as for our participants, 278 cases were extracted from the RCMP database system. Cases were chosen if they included at least one incident of sexual abuse, if they were from between the years 2008 to 2017, and if the case had come to a conclusion, that is, a verdict had been reached and the investigation has been closed. Now, as caregiver support was a main consideration in the current study, cases were then excluded if we were unable to measure caregiver support resulting in 212 cases. And finally, our sample was further broken down into child-on-child and adult-on-child perpetration. Now, this was done because initial analyses revealed that these two groups had significantly different means on child and abuse characteristics, such as relation and age at first incident, as well as investigative outcomes, such as investigation length, arrest, and conviction. Now, this resulted in a final 164 cases, which were retained for analysis. Now, as mentioned, first I examined descriptive statistics. So some of the more important findings were that out of those 278 cases total, we looked at descriptive statistics, 23% of those resulted in a conviction. Now, I feel that this number is important to note, as it's one that we would hope to see increase with more expedient disclosures. Now, the average duration of abuse was 503 days, with the average delays being 1,227 days, or well over 3 years. Now, from all cases, 4% denied abuse and 2% recanted previous statements. And finally, a full disclosure was made in 78% of cases. Now, our main analysis, of course, was the multivariate Cox regression analysis. So I'm just showing you our data for those who might be more statsy. Otherwise, what this says is that first, all our variables had a significant impact on the time it takes a child to disclose. This next column shows us in which direction delays are impacted. So we can see that age, gender, and level of support all resulted in an increased likelihood of a disclosure occurring. So, to put that in context, for every year a child ages, or for every new supportive behavior displayed by caregivers, the more likely a child was to disclose more quickly. For gender, females are more than twice as likely to disclose than males. And finally, for abuse characteristics, we see that as severity, frequency, or relation increased, the likelihood of making a disclosure decreased. So again, to put that in context, if abuse was more severe, frequent, or if the child and perpetrator were more closely related, the less likely they are to disclose abuse quickly. Now we'll discuss each of these in turn and how their findings can be applied to the work that you do. So child's age at time of first incident and forensic interview is a significant determinant of both memory, understanding, and even ability to describe the incident or incidents of sexual abuse. At one end of the spectrum, if a child is younger, they're likely to have difficulties disclosing due to cognitive and developmental limitations. They may not be able to communicate that abuse has occurred. And even if they could verbally describe the abuse, they may not recognize it as such. Now, this confusion may be exacerbated by statements made by the perpetrator, such as, "It's a game." It's not surprising then that children of this age are more likely to disclose accidentally and that rates of disclosure are lower. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, older children understand the abuse and are also able to communicate it. They understand the purpose of a forensic interview and can relate a fluid narrative. However, because of a greater understanding of right and wrong and of social norms, they may also experience greater feelings of shame or embarrassment. Often, youth in this age range state that they feel responsible and are fearful of the negative repercussions of disclosure for themselves and their family. Outsiders are also quick to lay blame on older children. Now, as identified earlier, the current study found that as children age, delays of disclosure significantly decreased. As predicted, young children had the longest delays between initial incident of abuse and disclosure, and the older age groups had the shortest. Now, beyond the obvious developmental limitations that young children face in regards to disclosure, ages 1 to 6 were also perpetrated against more often by intrafamilial perpetrators in 67% of cases, and most often the primary caretaker in 33% of this group. Likewise, the decrease in delay length at older ages could be due to a number of things. For example, children aged 15 to 18 at time of first incident are offended against more often by strangers and other extrafamilial perpetrators, such as friends, neighbors, and other acquaintances. In cases such as these, there are often fewer consequences to the family unit for a disclosure, resulting in shorter delays. Now, as age seems to be a substantial influence in delays of disclosure, this indicates a need for age-appropriate expectations in investigative interviews. Now, a greater difficulty disclosing at younger ages could be for a few reasons that I did outline a couple of. First is younger children's inability to communicate abuse. Now, I want to note here that we conducted all analyses twice, once including all ages, and a second time removing ages 1 to 4, who of course would be unable to communicate their abuse. Now, the findings continued to be significant, and this tells us that something beyond just developmental limitations is impacting disclosure in younger children. Now, a second reason for a greater delay is younger children's, of course, inability to understand that abuse is wrong. So as discussed earlier, their realization. A third reason for this delayed report could be in response to relation to perpetrator. When more closely related, this constitutes a breach of trust and perhaps even normalizes their behavior. Now, this will come into play later when we discuss relation to perpetrator and its impact on delays of disclosure. Fourth is less contact with outside adults who may be able to report the abuse. Now, more contact would increase the probability of a disclosure to a safe adult, such as a teacher, daycare worker, or even a friend's parent. And this applies to both purposeful and accidental disclosures. Now, I want to take a moment to relate this to current events. During the pandemic, children may be at an increased risk to experience abuse, as evidenced from increases in suspicious injuries in ERs, as well as increased disclosures to kids' helplines. But there's also an increased risk of not reporting, as they have less access to safe adults. And of course, this applies to all forms of abuse. And finally, older children and youth are better able to relate that fluid narrative, as discussed earlier, of abusive events to the police. Now, there have been different challenges identified for interviewing children of different ages. Picture you're approaching a child who's about to start their first interview. Depending on the age of that child you see, I'm sure you would employ very different strategies to build rapport and gain the child's trust. With younger children, your voice may hold a different tone, and the things you say will, of course, be very different than if you were to walk up to a teenager. Now, the main challenges when interviewing preschoolers are, of course, developmental. So limited verbal capacity, short attention span, and insufficient memory. Interviewing challenges are those such as time constraints, difficulties in answering questions, and being specific without being leading. And of course, there are also legal challenges, such as lack of detail, brief and incoherent testimonies, and credibility criteria. Now, some adjustments can be made for preschool age children, such as adapted and simplified language, such as shorter sentences and simple words, as well as talking slower and asking questions one at a time. Now, interviewers may also choose to shorten the pre-substantive phase due to time available before younger children fatigue. Now, some strategies for saving time include shortening or removing ground rules from introduction, or shortening or removing the practice narrative. Although I would caution, these two strategies have been found to improve interview detail in current and even subsequent interviews. Now, for school-age children, 7 to 12, common difficulties in interviews are things like barriers to disclosure and other interrelated factors. Now, many investigative interviewers report this group being the easiest to interview, as they can maintain focus and provide a coherent narrative. But barriers to disclosure include knowledge of the consequences, as well as shame and guilt that may also prevent them from telling. Now, assurances in this case of the positive outcomes may be beneficial, as well as normalizing experiences. And finally, adolescents, 13 to 17, represent their own unique challenges. Often, they don't want to disclose, want to avoid embarrassing subjects, and can be brief in their answers to questions. They may worry about what others will think if they find out about the experienced abuse, and often don't want to go through the legal process. Adolescents may also at this point demonstrate loyalty, protecting the perpetrator. So when interviewing this group, it can be difficult to build rapport and trust. And finally, another barrier. Adolescents also have developed their own sort of language, and it can be very difficult to keep up with slang and other communication trends. For example, in 2020, if a teenager said, "Bye, Felicia," or that you had zero chill, that would have been a very bad thing. Now, in the beginning, when ground rules are set, interviewers can state that they will ask them to clarify if they do not understand something. And of course, this is imperative in the use of slang. Now, for gender, males have been found to report at a lower rate than females, despite the fact that they experience CSA at what is still a substantial rate. Now, often males report fearing myths associated with male experiences of sexual abuse, such as that they will become gay, as most sexual abuse is committed by other males. Next, because of traditional views of masculinity that are dominant in many societies, there's also a greater stigma associated for men who've experienced sexual abuse than for women. And in turn, these men may be interpreted as weak. Now, we all picture that hyper-masculine male and how delicate his ego might be. Obviously not the case for children, but that idealized image of men needing to be strong is still very prominent. And finally, there is a fear that they will perpetuate the cycle of abuse against their own children, despite the fact that only a small number of those who've experienced abuse go on to commit it. Now, it's important to note here that child abuse is overly represented within offender groups, meaning that while not everyone who experiences abuse goes on to commit it, those who have committed abuse have a higher likelihood of also experiencing it as children. Now, greater endorsement of these myths has been associated with increased feelings of shame and embarrassment, which further impede non-disclosure. Now, for gender, we had relatively few male participants at a rate of 148 girls to 16 boys. However, despite low numbers of males, gender still had a significant impact on delays of disclosure, such that they delayed disclosure 2 times longer than girls. Boys also experienced their first incident of abuse younger than girls. as well as more incidents overall. Now, the finding of boys experiencing a higher frequency of abuse could be a result of their delay of disclosure. The longer a disclosure is delayed, the more time there is for multiple incidents to be carried out, as well as an increase in the perpetrator's confidence that the child will not tell as time goes on and with each additional incident. Now, it's also important to note here that on average, boys experienced less supportive reactions from non-offending caregivers than girls. Now, our findings suggest that it may be beneficial to remove gender-specific barriers, which can be done either directly or indirectly. In a more direct manner, when speaking with men or boys who have experienced sexual abuse, positive social interactions have been found to improve male experiences when disclosing, such as empathetic, social, and non-judgmental reactions. And of course, being careful not to minimize experiences. These can then encourage further disclosure, leading to more detail and forthrightness once already disclosing, and perhaps even a formal report down the road. Second, our findings suggest that it may be beneficial to correct gender-specific myths and provide reassurance. Now, indirectly, a shift is needed in social attitudes regarding men and boys who experience sexual abuse. This can be accomplished through one of the CYIC's primary objectives, community education. Education in school systems is imperative to increase the likelihood that either a girl or boy will come forward with report. However, many schools might be reluctant to administer programs addressing sexual abuse. So, another option is public service announcements that raise awareness of this issue and can help to increase the likelihood of a male disclosure, while also dispelling beliefs that they're the only one. This can be aided by male survivor statements. Hearing about other strong men's experiences with sexual abuse has been found to increase the likelihood that a boy or man will come forward with a report. When others speak out, it encourages others like them who have also experienced similar situations to come forward. Now, factors specifically related to the abuse can also impact rates of disclosure and are an important determinant of mental health outcomes, such as severity and frequency of abuse. Now, the direction in which severity impacts disclosure rates has been contested, and I'm going to propose to you two possible scenarios. So in the first scenario, and in line with some research, children who experienced more severe abuse report immediately because of a need to do something. Further, in the majority of studies, severity may refer to severe abuse that is also frequent, but abuse can be severe during a single incident, just as it can be less severe but occur multiple times. And so more severe forms of abuse may lead to greater consequences for the child and a need for protection that outweigh the costs to the family. Further, disclosure in this case may be inevitable due to the overt signs of more severe abuse. Now, alternatively, in the second scenario, and in line with other research, children who have experienced more severe abuse delay their disclosures. In this case, more severe abuse may compound feelings of shame experienced by the child in this situation, as well as fears of the negative repercussions and reactions. Now, this leads to the use of avoidant or numbing coping strategies, such as delaying disclosure or non-disclosure. Now, this coping strategy can result in greater post-traumatic and mental health symptoms. So, which one did we find? Well, we found that more severe abuse resulted in significantly longer delays of disclosure. In the current study, If a case involved the most severely rated forms of abuse, such as exploitation, this resulted in the longest average delay, with lengths surpassing 15 years. Now, despite the extremely negative consequences of severe abuse, this did not result in a decrease in delay of disclosure. Rather, it seems the stigma, shame, and fear for repercussions resulted in non-disclosure. Now, a similar pattern was found for frequent abuse, in that more frequent abuse also resulted in longer delays of disclosure. Now, injury itself can be heavily related to the number of mental health outcomes in adulthood, and often injury results from more severe abuse. Now, when abuse is severe, children here displayed avoidance behaviors by not disclosing to another. Further, if a child experiences multiple forms of abuse, such as witnessing domestic violence or emotional abuse and sexual abuse, the combination has been found to result in higher rates of non-disclosure. Now, the main takeaway here is that proper assessment of abuse severity early on can lead to more appropriate mental health support and less mental health symptoms in later adulthood. Now, as with severity, frequency was, of course, as I mentioned, found to significantly impact delays of disclosure, such that more incidents of abuse resulted in longer delays. Now, think for a moment about situations in which you think a child may be more likely to experience multiple incidents of abuse. Well, in our study, we found that when children were younger, they typically experienced more incidents of abuse than adolescents. We also found that when the perpetrator and child were more closely related, they were also more likely to experience multiple incidents of abuse. So first, it's important to note that more frequent abuse may be a symptom rather than a cause of longer delays of disclosure, in that the longer the abuse goes on unreported, the more opportunity the perpetrator will have to offend again. Now, in cases of more frequent abuse, grooming strategies may also be employed, such as manipulation and normalization of acts. And these are meant to create more opportunities for perpetrators to offend against the child. This can also assure that the children remain compliant and keep the abuse secret. In some cases, abusers may use aggression, fear, or even threats to obtain secrecy. For example, in the current study, 2 files indicated that the perpetrator threatened to assault siblings if the child disclosed. Now, as we saw previously, predictors of frequency of abuse are age and relation to perpetrator. So, of course, it's important to counteract the impact of age and relation on children's willingness to report the abuse. In this section, to counteract age, it's important to create opportunities for younger children to come into contact with other safe adults, so they may disclose accidentally or purposely. And of course, utilizing strategies within interviews, as discussed earlier. Furthermore, educating parents on recognizing the signs of sexual abuse early on may also help non-offending caregivers recognize that it may be occurring in the absence of a child telling them so. Now, as for relation to abuser, we will discuss this in more detail next. Now, of course, frequency of abuse is inextricably tied to the role the abuser plays in the child's life, as more frequent abuse almost always requires consistent access with the child, unlikely to happen with a stranger. It's not surprising then that more often children who experience sexual abuse are offended against by known adults. Now, I'm sure that we can all picture a situation that we've experienced in which we've been along for the ride when someone we cared about did something wrong. Perhaps your underage best friend was drinking or they stole something. Now, I want you to remember that feeling of uneasiness and almost nauseousness when you're not sure if you should tell on them or not. And of course, you might be scared about losing that friendship if you do. Now, while the situation does not approximate the situation of abuse, it can give us a small glimpse of that feeling that children may be experiencing when making the decision to disclose. Now, we found that the closer the relation between child and perpetrator, the longer disclosures took to obtain. Consistent with previous statistics, strangers committed sexual abuse against children considerably less often, at 8%, than other relations. In these cases, children are most often older, when the probability of having a stranger having contact with the child is heightened. Now, in 92% of cases, the perpetrator had a previous relationship with the child. And these findings help illuminate the challenges that law enforcement and support agencies face in obtaining disclosures, considering that the majority of cases will be perpetrated by a known individual in a position of trust. Now, especially when that abuse is committed by a primary caregiver, as was the case in 18% of files. Now, children who are offended against by an intrafamilial adult have been found to experience more frequent abuse, with previous findings demonstrating that most frequent abuse is committed by primary caregivers. In line with previous research, 80% of primary caregivers committed more than one incident, and 60% involved a troubling 10 or more incidents. Now, reporting a family member as the offender can have serious consequences for the family. When abuse is intrafamilial, consequences can involve loss of primary financial earner or removal of the child and even siblings from the home. Now, research has found that for older children, this decision to disclose is made very carefully, and the benefits and costs of their disclosure are considered. This is where frontline workers have the power to reassure children and even focus on some of those positive outcomes for a formal disclosure. Further, when the perpetrator is a known adult, this typically involves a breach of trust, which can further complicate children's decision to disclose. Now, if the child is hesitant to trust other adults, they may not provide a complete disclosure or one at all. In this case, initial rapport building should be emphasized. Now, closer relation can also increase fear of parental reactions, such as fear of not being believed or of getting into trouble. Caregivers should be encouraged to respond to children's everyday concerns empathetically. So if something does happen to the child, they can anticipate a supportive response from their caregiver. And they should, of course, encourage open communication regarding all topics. Now, when the caregiver is the main perpetrator, the idea of love will often come up in forensic interviews. Children may use love to explain why their caregiver offended against them, and offenders may employ that same rationale, terming their own behavior as love. Further, love may lead a child to defend the perpetrator. Now, ignoring this factor can result in recantation and also ignores a very large part of the child's experience. If mentioned within interviews, this topic should be dealt with rather than swept under the rug, as so often happens. Now, if the primary caregiver is the offender, this obviously leaves the child with a compromised support system. However, when non-offending caregiver relationships are strong, they can act as a protective factor, mitigating delays of disclosure. Now, if the abuse is intrafamilial, once again, the non-offending caregiver is put under additional strain. In these cases, the consequences to the family may be difficult to overcome and will directly impact the amount of support given to the child. Now, it may seem as though caregiver support should be a given without a second thought, but it can be very difficult for caregivers to accept that the child has experienced abuse. They may feel guilt for letting it take place, or it can be difficult to reconcile these two opposing views of the perpetrator, both a loved one and an abuser. And often, caregivers will respond to disclosures with initial disbelief, as occurred in 14% of our cases. Furthermore, McElvany in 2015 found that children expressed concern that disclosure would upset their parents, while others voiced concerns about the consequences to their family. And yet, positive non-offending caregiver support and positive perceptions of parental bonding have been found to increase disclosure rates and even positive prognoses in treatment. And non-offending caregiver support may also help to increase disclosure from boys, as they've often been found to initially disclose to their mothers. Now, I want you to think about a moment about the families that you work with. What would you consider a supportive caregiver? What are some of the ways that they might demonstrate to you that they are supportive? For me, I would consider things like believing them when they disclose, inhibiting contact between their child and the perpetrator, perhaps obtaining resources and support for their child, cooperating with investigations, and of course, if they were to assign blame to the child, that would be very unsupportive. Now, if the primary caregiver is the offender, once again, it leaves the child with a compromised support system. However, non-offending caregiver relationships, when they're strong, can mitigate delays of disclosure. When children received more support from non-offending caregivers, delays in disclosure was significantly shorter. Now, while other variables may indicate that a child may be at risk to delay or not disclose, non-offending caregiver support shows promise as a protective factor against this. Now, our study was unique in that it employed behavioral indicators of support. Traditionally, emotional support is measured through interviews of non-offending caregivers or through RCMP investigator reports. However, these measures have their own limitations. Non-offending caregivers may give biased answers, as there's much at stake for appearing to have low support for the child. For example, they might be taken from the home. Now, the current study examined caregiver behaviors taken to initiate and cooperate with an investigation into sexual abuse allegations. And although the use of behaviors to gauge caregiver support is novel, it can be hypothesized that they show the child that they are believed, and not only is what happened to them wrong, but that there are people on their side who are willing to support them throughout this process. Now, encouragingly, over half of the current sample, 54%, displayed only supportive behaviors, which is a far greater number than previous studies. Now, in the present study, on average, non-offending caregivers were less supportive when the perpetrator was intrafamilial. In these cases, feelings may then potentially be dealt with through cognitive processes such as denial and disbelief. Now, as caregiver support is vital for hasty disclosures, this provides rationale for taking a more holistic approach when treating children who've experienced sexual abuse, by also providing support to those who would in turn support them. Now, CYACs and investigators can aid in supporting both parents, both pre and post disclosure, with information and resources. The presence of these resources in the community may also help to increase the believability of disclosures when they do occur. Now, talking about sexual health and behavior with children can be difficult for some caregivers. But although it might be challenging, it should be encouraged as caregivers clearly play an instrumental role in disclosures. Now, several parents in the current study stated that they were too embarrassed or just didn't know how to approach the subject with their child. But education on ways to broach the subject would appear then to be highly beneficial. Parents can be taught that certain behaviors, which the current study found is more supportive, can increase the speed with which a formal disclosure is made. Now, these include, but are not limited to, believing your child, indicated through statements and actions, inhibiting further contact between the perpetrator and the child to protect them, obtaining resources for the child, such as through making a formal report, cooperating with investigations to perhaps demonstrate the seriousness of the situation, and of course, being very careful not to make statements indicating blame on the child for the abuse. For example, one parent stated that if the child had not behaved in such a way, this would not have happened. Now, these messages could be communicated to the public or directly through resources provided to caregivers of children who've experienced sexual abuse. Specifically, they could communicate the importance of belief for children disclosing. Now, outside agencies can also provide support to children impacted by abuse in the absence of parental support. It seems very appropriate then that CYCs take this holistic approach, providing support for children and their families. Now, CYCs can support non-offending caregivers through a number of ways. Some have even recently begun to employ specialists to work with caregivers of children who've experienced sexual abuse. And the current study provides empirical rationale for this development. All right, so now to wrap things up, I want to leave you with some final takeaways. First, factors that impact delays in reporting are crucial to study, as avoidant coping strategies have been found to lead to the greater presentation of trauma symptoms and the likelihood of re-experiencing abuse as an adult. The present study aimed to identify and understand factors that contribute to the speed at which a formal disclosure of sexual abuse occurs. And of course, it was found to be impacted by both child and abuse characteristics, such that when the child impacted is younger, male, experiences severe or frequent abuse by a close relative, and if they receive little support, risk of delays of disclosure are highest. Now, one of the most encouraging and important findings of the current study is that non-offending caregiver support expedited the speed with which formal disclosures were made. Increasing the speed is, of course, essential so that evidence is not lost and reports can be easily corroborated. Now, once a formal disclosure is made, resources can be obtained for the child and the perpetrator can be held accountable. Now, we consider these findings in the wake of how a child's formal report may lead to the identification of a dangerous offender, interruption of abuse, and prevention of abuse against further future children. How other individuals respond to a disclosure is crucial to improve the long-term outcomes for children who've experienced sexual abuse, as it may be a major contributing factor in their decision to make a formal report. Now, current findings suggest that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to obtaining an expedient disclosure, but rather multiple and complex factors play a role in when a child will provide a statement and reasons why he or she may not until a later point in time. Now, when investigators are attempting to obtain a disclosure of sexual abuse, they may utilize current findings from the present study by working to remove specific barriers that each child may be experiencing. All right, thank you so much for your time, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you took something away from this webinar. I've left my email here in case you have any further questions, but we of course have 5 minutes here now to answer a few for you. And again, questions can be posted on the Messages tab on the right. I went through my email very quickly, so perhaps I will also post it here. And thank you so much, Claire and Anna, for your wonderful comments. It was a pleasure to be here today to speak to all of you. It's so great to see this webinar was so well received. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, so we do have one question. It is, what if we don't know who the perpetrator is and it's someone close to the child? What are some phrases we can say to show the child that we will be supportive to them? Of course, I can't give you exact phrases because, as I mentioned, each child is so different. Depending on the age of that child, you might say very different things. And depending on if it's a male or female, you might also say very different things. I think just continually, you can point out the positive outcomes for a formal disclosure. You can assure them that you are there, and hopefully their non-offending caregiver is also there to support them. And I think just that show of support will mean a lot to them and perhaps will lead to a subsequent disclosure of who the perpetrator might be. Hopefully that answers your question. I have another question here. Prevention in school boards, and if I have any suggestions. That one is a very difficult one. I think we all know that schools like to shy away from this topic a fair bit. But of course, I will keep pushing. I think research is definitely needed within the school systems regarding those initial disclosures when they occur to teachers, because they are one of those trusted adults in a student's life. And once again, during the pandemic, they might have been the only adult to have contact with the child, whether it's through Zoom or not. So I think that researchers and frontline workers should encourage schools to consider these topics, update their training, and of course, if they're willing, conduct research, and then we can know more about the situation. I do agree. There's one comment here about the cultural aspect of non-disclosures, and I definitely think that it is a consideration for future research, as this will highly impact a children's decision to disclose, as well as even their caregivers' support of that disclosure. Excellent point. All right, we have 1 minute left, but I want you to know that I am so happy to answer any questions over email, and I can even delve in deeper into some of these issues. Thank you.